Picture waking up in 13th century England. The sun isn't even up yet, but you're already moving. Your bed is a pile of straw on a dirt floor. The animals that share your house are stirring. Through the gaps in your thatched roof, you can see the first hints of dawn. This is your life. This is everyone's life, unless you happen to be born lucky. For 9 out of 10 people in medieval Britain, that meant being a peasant. Your world was small. Most people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. The village you grew up in was probably the only place you'd ever know. Your day started at dawn and ended at sunset. You worked the land because that's what everyone did. Plowing, planting, harvesting. The cycle never stopped. You grew rye and oats and barley, peas if you were lucky. Everything with tools that would make modern farmers weep. A wooden plow, a sickle, maybe a scythe if your village could afford one. The animals you kept were nothing like what we have today. A full-grown medieval bull was about the size of a modern calf. Your sheep gave you less than a pound of wool per year. Compare that to over 7 pounds from a modern sheep. Your house was basically a shed. Earthen floor. Almost no windows because glass didn't exist for people like you. One room where your entire family slept together. And here's the thing that really gets me. Your animals lived inside with you. Chickens, maybe a pig. They kept you warm in winter, and you kept them safe from wolves. The smell must have been something else. Towards the end of the medieval period, things got slightly better. Some peasant houses expanded to 2 rooms. A few even had a second floor. But we're talking about gradual improvements over centuries. Your great-great-grandfather's house looked pretty much the same as yours. You didn't own the land you worked. Nobody asked if you wanted to be a peasant. You were born into it, and that was that. The lord of the manor owned everything, including the strips of land you were allowed to farm. In return, you owed him labor, lots of it. You plowed his fields, you harvested his crops, you built his roads, you cleared his forests. Church feast days were your only breaks, and those were tied to the farming calendar. Sowing days, reaping days. Even your rest days revolved around work. The taxes were brutal. You paid in work, you paid in crops, you paid in animals, and you couldn't just leave. The feudal system trapped you to the land. If you tried running away to find better wages somewhere else, you were breaking the law. Some lords would actively poach peasants from other manors and then refuse to let them return home. This caused so much chaos that in 1351, the government passed the Statute of Labourers. It declared that no peasant could leave their village and no lord could pay more than the wages from 1346. They literally froze wages by law to keep the feudal system running. Religion wasn't something you did on Sundays. It was everywhere. The church bells dictated your day. They told you when to wake up, when to work, when to pray, when to sleep. Everyone went to church. Everyone. Missing service wasn't an option unless you wanted serious trouble. The church was the center of village life. Weddings, baptisms, burials, community decisions all happened there. If you wanted salvation, you paid the church for prayers. If you wanted forgiveness, you paid for a pilgrimage. The church wasn't just powerful, it was the power. The monasteries held massive amounts of land and wealth. Monks and nuns lived lives completely separate from regular people. They had their own rules, their own economy, their own world within walls. 2/3 of England's clergy died during the Black Death. Think about that for a second. The very people who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort during the worst crisis imaginable were dying faster than anyone else. Their close living quarters and constant contact with the sick made them prime targets. Summer 1348. A ship arrived at a port in Dorset. The exact date isn't certain. Maybe late June, maybe early August. Nobody was paying much attention to one more merchant vessel. The sailors looked fine when they landed. But within days, people in Dorset were dying. Not just sick, dying. Fast. The plague had arrived in England. By Christmas, it had torn through the southern counties. By spring 1349, it hit London. By summer, it covered the entire country. The symptoms were horrific. It started with sweats and vomiting. Nothing too alarming at first. Then came the spasms as your body lost control of its muscles. Black bruises appeared under your skin. Huge swellings, called buboes, erupted in your groin and under your arms. Black, pus-filled lumps that gave the plague its name. Most people died within 5 days. Some lasted 3 days. A very unlucky few suffered for 4 days before dying. If you developed the pneumonic form, where it attacked your lungs, it was 100% fatal. Everyone who got that version died. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population died. Let that sink in. In some villages, everyone died. Complete ghost towns. Fields went unplowed. Livestock wandered freely with nobody to tend them. Crops rotted in the ground. The monk Henry of Knighton wrote that many villages became quite desolate with no one left in the houses. People died so fast there wasn't time for proper burials. Mass graves became necessary. Bodies piled up because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. The Pope had to grant blanket forgiveness for sins because people were dying without last rites or confession. You could confess to another layperson, even to a woman, the decree said. That's how desperate things got. Here's where it gets interesting. The survivors suddenly had leverage. There weren't enough workers left to do all the jobs that needed doing. For the first time in their lives, peasants could demand better wages. Lords were competing for labor. Some were paying double or triple the old rates. The whole feudal system started cracking. The government panicked and passed laws to freeze wages and prevent people from moving around. But you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Peasants had tasted what it felt like to be valuable, to be needed. They weren't going back quietly. For those who survived, taxes went down, wages went up, living conditions slowly improved. Peasants started feeling significant for the first time in history. But this created massive resentment among the nobility, who saw their power slipping away. The tension kept building. 30 years after the plague, it exploded into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It fundamentally changed how English society worked. Let me tell you about some things that sound made up, but aren't. Metal needles were incredibly valuable. If you were a wealthy medieval lady, you might own 6 of them. 6! In the 14th century, metal needles were worth more than diamonds. Most women made do with bone needles or thorns. Sugar and pepper cost more per weight than gold. Salt was so expensive it was used as currency. These weren't luxury goods. They were basics that most people simply couldn't afford. Musicians were seen as rogues and thieves. They could perform inside a house, but afterwards they had to sleep in the stables or barn. No exceptions. Animals apparently had the same social status as entertainers. If you were born left-handed in a world of right-handed tools and rules, you adapted or struggled. Nobody accommodated you. Women had almost no rights. Noble women couldn't choose their own husbands. Their fathers made those decisions. But here's an interesting wrinkle. Widows could inherit their husband's business. Many widowed women with property refused to remarry because marriage meant losing control of their estates. Widowhood offered more freedom than marriage ever did. The justice system was brutal, but weirdly logical by medieval thinking. If you were accused of a crime, you underwent trial by ordeal. One version involved holding a red-hot iron bar and walking 3 paces. If your hand healed after 3 days, you were innocent. If it didn't, you were guilty. Another ordeal involved being tied up and thrown in a pond. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. Of course, if you sank, you might drown, but at least you'd die innocent. The logic was that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. Can't argue with divine judgment, right? Towns were different from villages. They had walls. Real stone walls with gates that locked at night. York's medieval walls still stand today. They're the most complete medieval city walls remaining in England. These walls weren't just for show. Viking raids in the early Middle Ages had taught everyone a harsh lesson. If you didn't have walls, you didn't survive. So villages built walls and became towns. Towns built bigger walls and became cities. Inside those walls, life operated under completely different rules than the countryside. Towns ran on guilds. Every craft had a guild. Blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, bakers. You couldn't just decide to be a blacksmith. You needed to apprentice with a guild member. Usually started when you were a boy. You'd work for years learning the craft. The guild controlled everything. Quality standards, prices, who could work, who couldn't. It was a closed system, but it maintained standards and protected members. Children from town families were often sent away to work as servants or apprentices in other households. This was more common in towns than in villages. It taught them trades and made connections between families. People lived by the sun because they had no choice. You woke at dawn, you went to bed at sunset. Light was expensive. Candles cost real money. Most were made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat. They stank and smoked and barely gave off light. Wax candles were luxury items for the wealthy. People would be paid in candle ends in a cash-poor society. Churches competed to keep more candles burning more of the time. Groups of parishioners pooled resources to outdo other groups. In a world lit only by fire, any illumination in the darkness was a wonder. House fires were incredibly common. People would try to stay up just a little later by keeping oil lamps or candles burning. We know this because house fires caused by these lamps show up constantly in medieval records. The urge to have a few more hours of light was strong enough that people risked burning down their homes. Think about that. The darkness was so oppressive that people would rather risk fire than go to bed early. Your great-great-great-grandfather probably felt the same way. For most people, food was monotonous. Bread, pottage, which was basically grain boiled with whatever vegetables you had. Maybe an onion. Some peas if you were lucky. Meat was rare. You might get some at a feast, but day to day you survived on grain products. Your wooden bowl and spoon were your only tableware. No forks. Those didn't exist for common people. You ate with your hands and your spoon, and that was it. But several times a year there were feasts. Harvest feasts, parish ales, guild celebrations. These were extravagant by medieval standards. Actual meat, fish, spiced dishes, ale and wine flowing freely. Even people who ate spare, monotonous meals most of the year could regularly look forward to these events. The anticipation must have been intense, knowing that in a few weeks you'd get to eat things you never saw otherwise. Fancy cups with feasting slogans suggest people looked forward to better tableware at feasts too. Not just the food, but the entire experience of abundance. Medieval Britain was harsh, no question about it. Most people worked brutal hours their entire lives and owned almost nothing. They died young. They suffered diseases we can cure with antibiotics. They lived in conditions we'd consider uninhabitable. But they weren't miserable every second. They had feast days. They had community. They had the satisfaction of harvest successfully brought in. They found joy in small things, because small things were all they had. A good crop year, a successful birth, a wedding celebration, a few hours of candlelight past sunset. What strikes me most is how recent this all was. We're talking about 30 generations ago. Your ancestors lived this life. They woke with the sun. They worked until dark. They survived plagues and famines. They raised families in one-room houses with earthen floors. And somehow, we're here because they made it through. Every single one of your ancestors survived long enough to have children. That's a pretty impressive track record, considering what they faced. The medieval period ran from William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 to Richard III's defeat at Bosworth in 1485. That's over 400 years, longer than the United States has existed. During that time, English society was built and rebuilt. The feudal system rose and fell. The plague killed millions and changed everything. The church reached its peak power and began to decline. Ordinary people slowly gained rights that their grandparents couldn't have imagined. And through it all, life continued. People fell in love. They raised children. They told stories. They found meaning in their constrained lives. If you walk through England today, you're walking on land that medieval peasants ploughed. The parish churches they built still stand. The walls they constructed still protect old city centres. York, Chester, Canterbury. These places preserve something of that medieval world, even as everything around them changes. Next time you see a medieval building, remember it was built by people who would find our world completely incomprehensible. Central heating, electric lights, international travel, medical care that actually works. We live in comfort they couldn't dream of, but they built the foundation we're standing on.